Keith is the professor emeritus from University of South Carolina. He's also the inventor of Brace Guard, which is a unique product to help you with braces and other things. And he earned his doctorate from University of Oklahoma. And this presentation is what he earned his doctorate for, and it's totally relevant with what we're talking about. So let's welcome Keith Amstutz.
Of my presentation is, as Jeff said, based on my dissertation, which was a video fluorographic study of the teeth aperture, instrument pivot, and the tongue arch in trumpet performance. Now, Claude and I were both clinicians for one of Charles Colin's national brass conferences in New York, and after seeing my presentation, he came up and said, well, he's so happy to see that my outcome, goes right along with everything he's been saying for years, and asked if I'd be willing to go to California the next summer and work as a faculty member with his camp. So it was a question of being in Columbia, South Carolina at 102 degrees with a heat index of 108, or spending a few days south of San Francisco. No contest. And it was a wonderful experience, and Claude Gordon was a tremendous educator, tremendous performer, and I applaud Jeff for having this camp to promote the Claude Gordon techniques, which really work. Now, in this presentation, you're actually going to be able to observe the oral cavity of trumpet players while they are performing. So we can always speculate, what actually is that tongue doing? Or how are the teeth changing? What's the instrument pivot? But here's a chance to actually look and be able to see on film the functions of these organs. Now, in a nutshell, I was able to video fluorograph or x-ray 25 very competent trumpet players while they were performing with sound a series of exercises. Now, the camera that was involved with the filming had what they call an image intensifier. So my final product was a videotape with sound of the oral cavity of trumpet players that were playing these exercises, blown up by a factor of 2.8. So you would look at the screen, and here you would see this giant face, playing exercises. So now that I had this material down, I was able to use the freeze frame or stop image capabilities of an Ampex videotape recorder to actually isolate the beginning of each note that these subjects played in the exercises. And then I was able to, from this freeze frame, measure the teeth aperture, the space between the tongue and the tip of the elevation of the tongue and the palate, and the angle of change with the instrument pivot, and then go through a statistical evaluation of these factors. And the end product was the study did confirm that there is a positive correlation with the tongue arch, teeth aperture, and instrument pivot in trumpet performance. Now, so here, bravo, we can actually see something and make some comments that are actually based on fact rather than just sort of trying to, well, I think this is happening. Now, when you're doing research of this nature, it's very important that you have a subject group that is representative of your population. In this case, trumpet players. So with my 25 trumpet players, there were quite an age difference, age from 18 to 45. And then geographically, the players came from 12 different states and also had been under the taking lessons with 63 different trumpet teachers. So that's really a very broad representation of the trumpet playing community. So people always ask, well, all right, you did this. Is there anybody that I know that was involved with this? So I'd like to just list 4 names. John J. Haney, the very famous trumpet professor at North Texas State, now the University of North Texas, was very intimately involved with this. Another trumpet player named John Thomas. And John is in LA, very active as a studio performer, and has just recently had an educational series come out, and I've forgotten the name of the company, but he's a very well-known now performer and educator. Then Bob Lanise is a trumpet player, and I'll talk a little bit about Bob later, made his fame in Europe with his recordings, both classical and jazz, has just, the last few years, come back to the United States and is still enjoying a very, very fine trumpet career in both jazz and classical performance. And then the 4th person I'd like to mention is Richard Waddell. Now, Richard Waddell is known as the ceremonial trumpet player of Boston and the founder of the Boston Brass. So there are 4 people that admittedly quite a bit older than when they first took part in this research, but that's the caliber of player that we were dealing with in doing the video fluorography study. Now, in doing a study of this nature, there's one thing that's a major problem, and this is that you're dealing with X-ray, with radiation exposure. And if you've read the paper lately, you know that, oh, now there's a big fuss over the fact that these new airport scanners for security are going to be using radiation to fluoroscope the bodies of the people that go by, and how detrimental this is to your health. Well, with that in mind, now say, picture coming in and say, hey, I've got a bunch of trumpet players, and I'd like to go ahead and just video fluorograph them for a period of time and see what's happening. Is this medical? Well, no, but it sounds like fun. So in order to do this, I had to have the approval in the state of Texas for the State Radiation and Control Board. So they had to go through a whole bunch of interviews and the equipment and the invention exposure, et cetera. And then after a period of time, and they're studying my proposal, they said, all right, we will give you permission to do this, provided you have a signed release saying that this is, I am of legal age and I'm doing this study of my own free will, there's no incentives in there. And basically, yeah, I want to do this, I'm not going to sue you at any time in the future. And then the second thing was, yes, you can do this, but you have the limitation of a maximum exposure time of 2 minutes. So then, here's a whole new ballgame. All right, I've got 2 minutes in which to have exercises that are going to display what I want to do, and let me be able to then measure and come up with consistent information. So I can get my little button to work. We had to come up then with exercises. So with these exercises, you can see that I picked the C major arpeggio on the B flat trumpet. I did this for the reason that I wanted to show this sort of like a practical normal playing range of the trumpet. So we've got 2 octaves from low C to high C. And then each of the exercises needed to be performed in one breath so that the performer wasn't taking the instrument away from the lips, resetting the embouchure, and then continuing to play. I wanted to have a consistent exercise where I could see without the instrument coming off the face. In order to be consistent, I just said, well, let's use a mezzo forte dynamic level, and if you perform at 84 for the quarter note, I'd be able to get all my exercises in there and everything, and I'd still have about 8 seconds to spare with my radiation control ruling. So with those limitations, I was set and I was ready to go. I picked 3 exercises. The first one was just a gradual change. The second one was skipping partials of the overtone series. And then the third exercise with the octaves is more of an extreme register change. And with the giving a good point of reference for anyone for each of the exercises, gave me very good statistics for measurement capabilities. Excuse me. So also in performance, we're dealing with something that's either tongued or slurred. So each person then would play the exercise first tongued and then slurred. Now all of these subjects had the material well in advance because it was a one time only. The performer could not stop in the middle of an exercise, start over, just had to be go at the top and go. At a chance between, say, the first exercise after it was played tongue, there was a break to, shake the water out of the horn and all that, take a good breath, and then have the equipment start again and do the second time through. So those were the exercises that I used for this study. Now, we've already heard Jeff talking a bit about the tongue arch, so I would like us to say the syllable ah. Well, form an embouchure and say the syllable ah. Ah. Now the syllable e. Now I'd like you to take your tongue and put it in a position to say, the letter T, but put it in that position and blow, but don't move the tongue. And you'll see that you have a seal there, which is the basis for our articulations. Now, you will notice that with the tongue, your seal point is not the tip of the tongue, it's somewhere back on the tongue. Also, the tongue is not pointing up. I like to look at the tongue as the idea of being sort of a sophisticated or semi-sophisticated nozzle, where you have the aperture, the space between the palate and the tongue, controlling the speed of the air. So if the air must go through a narrower space, it's going to go faster, a wider space, it's going to go a little bit slower. And if you think of airflow, if the tongue is pointed up, you're going to have this then interruption, almost like a reverse spin of the air, which is quite detrimental. Another thing is if you say this, if you think of an E being up and forward, not back, makes a big difference. If you go back with sort of an if you just say ek for me, ek, you can feel closing off the throat. And closing off the throat is also then, of course, going to affect the airflow. So what happens if you have your oral cavity here, and then you slow up the air, you restrict it back, you make the space narrower at the back, the air speeds up, but then it goes into the larger oral cavity, and effectiveness is lost. It's much like a garden hose where if you have water coming out on your feet, and you want to get it off your feet, being lazy, you just put your thumb over the end. The air has to be water, or air analogy, goes through a narrower space, it goes faster, and gets off your shoes. If I have the hose here, and I reach back here and just squeeze it back there, water's still going to end up coming off and spraying all over my feet. So how the air is controlled is very crucial, and the tongue positioning has a lot to do with this. So what we found out happens is when we went into the upper register, the teeth came closer together. In the lower register, teeth came further apart. We also found that, with the tongue, it was going to elevate into more of an E position and for the upper register, and down more to an A for the lower register. Now you're going to see the insides of 4 different trumpet players, and you're going to see different tongues, different sizes of tongue, completely different shapes of the of the palate, the top of the mouth. And so we've got several you'll be able to watch and see a lot of different changes, a lot doing the same thing but in different ways. Now, with the instrument pivot, there are 2 ways that can be achieved. And one is you can do it by tilting the horn, or the head can move. So it may not look like the horn is not moving at all, but a motion of the head is getting this same pivot concept going forward. Okay, we have, after the exercises here, let's move forward. I'd like to show you the oral cavity so you have a little idea here of what we're looking for. You've got, of course, the teeth, and then you have the mandible or the jaw that's going to be going forward. And they're outlined in green, we have the palate. And then at the very back is a flap called the velopharyngeal closure. Now this is the flap that closes so that the air does not come out your nose. And you'll be able to observe that this sort of snaps and locks into position before the initial attack is made. So you've got a seal. So you're getting the air going through the lips and not up through the nose. So I'd like to then talk a little bit about the film itself. I was first asked to do a presentation with the video fluorography by David Hickman for one of the ITG conferences at the University of Illinois. And he'd talk with John Haney about his research. Here was a chance actually to see, and he thought that this would be a very important thing for the ITG members. I was very enthusiastic about this, so I went back to my tape of trumpet players, of skeletons playing trumpet, only to find out that, unfortunately, with the earlier videotapes, they had a tendency, when they were stored, for the signal to bleed or even to lose strength. So then I discovered that I had this material, but the signal had deteriorated sufficiently that I really could not duplicate it and have an image that could be shown on a screen that had more concise changes between the organs. So then plan B then was to call John Haney and see if there was a way that I could have access to some of his materials. Only to find out that since he used the same protocol that I did with his research, that his material was not salvageable either. So I was caught between a rock and a hard place, and the answer to that was to redo this. So I was able to talk to the Richland Memorial Hospital Radiology Department in Columbia, South Carolina, to go along with the idea of video fluorographing for professional trumpet players. Only problem here was that the equipment at Richland Memorial was not equipped for sound. So I had my image, but no sound. To get around this problem, I was able to tap a metal rod so that would be going inside the viewing screen of the X-ray. So then I would have a sort of a click track to work with, and then through the use of the audio-visual services at the University of South Carolina, we went along then and were able to go back and have the players play with themselves and put down a soundtrack for this. And while I was doing this, it says, hey, you know, we do a lot of studying and making suggestions based on just what we see externally. Now, so here's a chance to take these same performers, view them externally, and then view them internally so you can actually see what is happening and see how accurate your projections were based on the external observation. So no project is without its pitfalls. And in this one, when we did all the recording with the external shots, including the famous little clipboard that you see on the movies, when we had went to have it put together, add the sound and the picture, we found out that the audio part had been malfunctioning and not quite working at the proper speed. So we have a pitch differential that you'll be observing that's, in my opinion, quite annoying. It's a little bit higher in pitch than the actual pitch should be. The pitch you'll hear with at the X-ray footage, however, is accurate. So at this point, I'd like to go ahead and run the video. One of the nice things you can see with this also, you can take a look at mouthpiece pressure, which we always talk about a lot.
During past decades, trumpet instructors have been forced to rely on two basic forms of diagnosis in their attempts to solve performance difficulties of their students. The most obvious method has been to listen to the performer and make recommendations based on the desired qualities either present or absent from a given passage. The second means is to examine the student externally for some physiological inconsistency, which can be related to the difficulties experienced in performance. In the last few years, the science of video and cinefluorography has progressed to the point where it can be safely and effectively applied to the analysis of trumpet performance. Under proper medical supervision, the functions of the oral cavity and related organs can be fluorographed during performance and recorded on videotape or film. It is this method of analysis which has been employed in this study of the tongue arch, teeth aperture, and instrument pivot in trumpet performance. To facilitate viewing of the X-ray film, the major organs are identified on this skeletal outline: the mandible or jaw, the upper and lower teeth, the tongue, the soft and hard palate, and the velopharyngeal closure. The velopharyngeal closure is the valve which closes the nasal passage when performing or swallowing. Visualize the location of the various organs during the X-ray performance.
You see the face of the mouthpiece, and then of course you see the teeth. And that gap in between there is what we affectionately call the chops. And so you can see with the relationship between the mouthpiece and the teeth.
Observe the tongue motion in the following example.
A decrease in mouthpiece pressure.
Observe the teeth aperture change in the same exercise. Note both head and mouthpiece motion for the instrument pivot.
In this video photographic recording, each person also had just one chance to perform. Couldn't go back and do
The
it
basic
twice.
research utilized 3 series of tongue and slurred exercises demonstrating gradual, moderate, and extreme register changes.
external. Palate, different sized tongue. Now in this individual, we always talk about, should the mouthpiece be placed in 1/3, 2/3, how should this be done and all that. So observe externally the mouthpiece, how you picture the placement would be on this individual. Closure in this subject.
The second series of exercises represents register change skipping partials of the overtone series.
The instrument pivot is more obvious as we start getting into the wider changes of the skipping partials. see that there are two different types of motion with the tongue, or all of the variables actually. Some are much more exact snapping, and some are more gradual. And if you listen, you'll find that the people that make the gradual change sort of have a sliding into the pitch. The people that are more focused make an exact change. The notes will center quicker and be more in tune. Which is sort of, again, going along with some of the things that Jeff's going to be talking about.
The third series of exercises represents extreme register changes.
When you get to the X-ray viewing here, you can note quite a bit of difference in the mouthpiece pressure as the face of the mouthpiece gets closer to the teeth and the chops get more compressed. You can also note a difference in the sound for those that make more of a pressure change than those that do not. See my bar that was used for determining setting the tempo in the top. I'm trying to beat the pitch into their heads. Check the change in mouthpiece pressure in the X-ray viewing. If he had braces, he'd be a prime candidate for my brace guard product.
The following is a summary of the consistent tendencies observed throughout the research. The tongue arches for higher pitches and flattens for lower pitches. The teeth aperture decreases as the pitch ascends and increases as the pitch descends. The instrument pivots or tilts downward for the upper register and upward for the lower register. There is a greater amount of change in all areas as the size of the intervals increase. and there is a greater amount of change in slurred performance than in tongued performance. It is hoped that the results of this study will stimulate a more efficient and effective approach to trumpet instruction. Given precise knowledge of the role performed by the tongue, teeth aperture, and instrument pivot, the instructor will be able to recommend change in a more intelligent and logical manner. It is realized that these functions represent a very small facet of the physiological relationships required for accurate trumpet performance. However, if this research can stimulate discussion and additional research, the result will be brass instruction through diagnosis instead of trial and error.
Okay, so you can, here you've had the opportunity to actually look at inside of what happened, what is happening when we perform. So you can see how, as Jeff's going to be talking with Claude Gordon, there's definitely a relationship with the tongue and its positioning, that the tongue is going to arch higher, creating a smaller spacing between the palate and the top of the tongue for the upper register, and then dropping for the lower register. The teeth aperture increases and decreases. It gets smaller for the upper register, more open for the lower register. And then with the instrument pivot, the instrument tilts down for the upper register and up a little bit for the lower register. Now what the teeth aperture change and the instrument pivot help do is, as you can then create some changes here in the oral cavity size without having a lot of movement with the chops themselves. So it lets you get more flexibility, more control, more range without making a lot of drastic physical motion. Because as we saw with the buzzing, you can only do so much change and then you run out of space. Each of these individuals had, completely different tongues, oral cavity size, palate, shape, contours, and these all affect definitely the trumpet performance. So with this in mind, in working with this, my opinion is you sort of start in the middle and work both ways. Don't try to do any extremes, and in applying the Claude Gordon exercises, you'll be able to then isolate these specific aspects and work for getting them so they become second nature. And the object is to be able to play musically without having to necessarily think, well, I need to zig here or zag there for any specific pitch, but to, in the practice sessions and with the exercises, have sufficiently had these exercises so everything is just second nature, that you can just relax and play. As I was talking with Jeff earlier, Bob Lanice, one of the famous trumpet players that was involved in the first study, came to me before the taping session and said, I've been in my studio practicing these exercises, and I really don't think I do any of these things. I don't feel there's much any teeth aperture or pivot or tongue, because I just don't do that. And I know you're doing this for a dissertation, and I know you're going to be statistically analyzing all the results, and I don't want to ruin your theories, so I'll be just happy just to, say thank you but no thanks and not take part. And so I said, well, part of the idea of this type of research is to confirm if something is happening or isn't happening, and if you don't do it, well, that's just supporting the fact that not everybody does this. But then when we got back and we're starting to go through these, and everyone had a chance then to view their x-ray images, of course, and everyone was getting in position and to get a setting or a reading, each person would say, give their name, and then before they would go. And so here was this person who was saying his name was Bob Lanice and had Bob Lanice's cavities and all that, playing these exercises, and his use of the tongue arch, the teeth aperture change, and the instrument pivot was probably the best example of any of my 25 subjects. Here's a guy that didn't think he did it. And he was also one of the most musical players that I have heard. He wasn't thinking of these specific zigs and zags. His object was to make music, and after all, that's what we're here to do too. It's not to do exercises. We're out here to do something aesthetic and to make good music. So This is basically my presentation. I'll be very happy to discuss any aspects of this.